Hey Taylor, thanks for coming on the show. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm doing well. Um, so just before we get things rolling, for those who have never heard what you do, could you describe your presence in the arts industry?
I'm a luthier, both in terms of traditional violin making, but also in terms of solid body electric guitars. I run two companies. One is called Twitch Guitars, which uses environmentally responsible timber on the construction of all the instruments. And they're essentially very traditional, very classical electric guitars inspired by like the Les Paul and the Strat and the Telecaster. But out deforesting the rainforest.
Great, great. Um, so you've got I've seen you've got quite the following on TikTok lately. Can
Inexplicably.
you can yeah, can you speak to sort of what sort of got you into doing that, and then like what that's been like?
Well, the thing for me essentially is that traditional violin making, especially, has been very gate kept for a very long time, where the options were either a formal education, which is cost prohibitive to a lot of people, or a traditional apprenticeship, which is prohibitive in terms of having to invest time and still earn a living to keep a roof over your head. So for me, it was basically demystifying the art of violin making so that, the next generation is a lot more inclusive than this one is, because as it stands, just by virtue of being under 60, I'm already a minority, and like I want more queer and I want more people of color and I want a great diversity of people in the coming generations, because it's through that diversity that we can continue to improve the art instead of sort of staying stuck in a rut.
Yeah. So um so what like in terms of like the kind of violins that you're making, what, like, you have a range of violins and other instruments in that, what can you just sort of talk more about those sort of things?
Yeah, certainly. In the traditional bowed instrument world, I do violins, I do violas, I do cellos, I do the occasional upright bass, although shipping is cost prohibitive, so those mostly just stayed locally. And by and large, violin making has been sort of a hyper traditional industry where it's basically, if it's not a copy of an Italian maker, it's not worth doing. And I certainly do a lot of that, but I've also been working more recently on instruments that are targeted specifically towards the folk music community, because I think, that is very much the music of the people, that's from the people, and they've been sort of under catered to in the violin world.
Yeah.
So I do
So
everything
what
from, very traditional copies of like the Il Canone Guarnerius to a very specific folk fiddle that's actually got a mahogany back inside, so it's a lot more earthy, a lot warmer sounding, not quite as shrill and cutting as a classical violin might be otherwise.
hmm. For those who might not know, could you describe the difference between what you'd call like a classical violin and a fiddle?
By and large, the difference is in the hands of the player and in the final setup of the instrument. When it comes to a folk fiddle, quite often it'll have a flatter arching to the bridge, and that's essentially just to better enable playing drone strings. But also
Oh,
in
okay.
the case of building an instrument that's specifically targeted to folk musicians, I aim more for clarity of tone and their ability to sort of express themselves artistically on the instrument rather than necessarily complexity of tone. And I don't necessarily aim for a specific character sonically for that instrument. So I'm not necessarily going, hey, this is going to excel at Brahms or Bach or any of those things. I sort of go, hey, this is a tool that you can use to create your art, because fundamentally, I think it's what a luthier is. We're building tools for musicians.
Hmm. Yeah, so it seems like through your, through your lutherie, and through TikTok, and through just all the things that you do, that sort of making room for any kind of art, any kind of, all kinds of representation seems to be at the core of what you're doing. What sort of has brought that to the forefront for you?
I mean, I think the thing for me is like, as much as I love lumber and as much as I love working with my hands, I like people more, and I like affording people opportunities that they might not otherwise have. Um, I think everyone is fundamentally an artist. Everyone is designed to express themselves in some way that matters, that is meaningful, and to provide tools to allow them to do that, to allow them to express themselves in a significant and lasting way, is paramount to what I do. in addition to just building things that look and sound nice, I want to be able to go, hey, here's something that's specifically for you instead of just here's something.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so when it comes to creating, I mean, you're like a capital M maker, like through and through, you know. Can you go through some of the things that you've made? Because I know you make stuff other than instruments.
Yeah, I volunteer as Santa Claus for children that are in palliative care or shelters or hospitals or hospice care. So I make a lot of toys, everything from like actual wooden toys, which is vaguely similar to my regular day job, to stuffed animals. I basically just need to create constantly. Otherwise, I feel like I've not done anything meaningful with that day.
Yeah. What's something that you're most proud of that you've made?
I have recently, in a manner of speaking, resurrected the viola da braccio, which was a lost instrument from the Renaissance era. It was more or less surpassed by the violin by about the 1560s. I can grab one to show you, or I can grab it to show you if you want. I think it's a very interesting instrument, and it's certainly very full of character. And I just think it's fascinating. Do you want me to grab it and show
Yeah,
you?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right behind me. Nothing important, Bell. It's fine. So this is the viola da braccio that I was working on.
Okay.
It takes elements of the viola d'amore and the viola da gamba, and it's basically in a fairly traditional violin form. This is a soprano viola da braccio, so it's actually tuned the same as a violin as well, and it's got a heart.
What's
I
the
just think that's adorable.
like yeah. So the waist is very different from like a regular well from a regular from the more modern violin. What's
Yeah.
like what are some of like the big differences that are
Well, the
going on
big
there, and
difference
like
is
what's the reasoning?
the sound hole specifically. This was developed about 85 or 90 years before the violin as we know it was. And it basically takes a lot of design characteristics from the viola d'amore, which was usually an 8, 12, or 16 string instrument, where all
Oh.
but 4 or 5 were drone strings. So it takes a lot of elements of that. There's the flaming sword of Islam sound holes to the very pinched waist, the very tapered shoulders. This has a fairly traditional violin scroll just because I felt like it, but it's also got a significantly shorter fingerboard, and there are no corner
Hmm.
blocks in it. So the top and back plates are very free to vibrate. So it's a very warm, very loud instrument compared to, say, a modern violin.
So why would they have made those changes, do you think, to the more modern violin?
But this is fundamentally a different instrument. I think what happened was, well, definitively what happened was the late Renaissance era in Brescia, which is a region of Italy where they were making an absolute multitude of viola da gambas, viola da braccios, and viola da mores. War had come into the region and it spread the plague with it. So a lot of the traditional instrument makers at the time had perished, either from
Hmm.
war or from the plague. And then basically regionally in Cremona, which is where the modern violin was more or less developed, they did not have war in that region at the time. So their makers had persisted and basically came up with what is more or less this. And it's interesting because they're only about 50 kilometers apart, the two cities, but they were Italy wasn't a country yet, so they were sort of just unincorporated regions at the time.
Hmm. Yeah. So very it's very apparent that you've done your research, and you know the history of these instruments. What role does the history of the instrument go into what you do?
I think for me, violin making is sort of a convergence of history and arts and also math and science. And those are all things that I'm passionate about because I'm an incredible nerd. Um, so I think to remain historically informed is important, but lutherie and classical music world are inherently Eurocentric. So it's something that I sort of try to mitigate with actually accommodating individual players or individual clients. But it's something that I do still try to honor in some way, shape, or form through my work. And I
Hmm.
think if nothing else, it just allows me to make better informed decisions on behalf of clients who might not know exactly what they're looking for at that point.
Yeah. So do you tend to lean more into the like the Eurocentric history of the violin? Um, because like you talk a lot about creating space for sort of a newer generation a more inclusive art form. How do you sort of weigh those two like not interests, but you know what I mean?
I think it's an interesting and complicated dichotomy in that I want to, on the one hand, maintain the historical integrity of an instrument, but
Sure.
also accommodate individual players whose desires or needs or interests are not necessarily rooted harshly or firmly in, Eurocentric history. So for me, because I'm basically accommodating musicians rather than just accommodating history, I will do
Hmm.
one-to-one conversations anytime I'm developing an instrument or building an instrument just for them to go sort of, hey, what are your unique needs? What can I do to accommodate that? And how much is the traditionalism important to you? Because there are a lot of classically trained musicians who very much are still in the mindset of, Italian violins are the only violins that are really worthwhile, when there are absolutely brilliant makers that were even from the Indian subcontinent in the 1700s who were doing things that were not very traditional in terms of violin making, but which were nonetheless fascinating and then very uh, good.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
going to
I
go on a
mean,
rant,
it's.
but then I just went, no, good is sufficient.
I know there's so much we could get into about about the like the lack of representation in what you do. I would assume, right? Like um that there's so much there. Um I really don't know where we would even start. Um like that's what I guess what is the like in Luthery, like what's the community like?
Well, it's interesting in that I've got sort of feet in both the electric guitar world, which is very left of center, very progressive, and generally fond of innovation. And then I've got another foot
Huh.
that's in the violin making world, which is generally right of center and traditionalism over even necessarily being good.
Yeah.
So it's sort of interesting that I'm involved in both communities, at least tangentially. But I will say that the violin making community is a lot more accepting, a lot more progressive than they were in, say, the generation before mine. So it's moving in the right direction, just not as quickly as I would like.
Right. Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
at violin making conventions in 2019, to see even just a female luthier is a pleasant surprise because it's basically a room full of white haired white men.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So anything to sort of break that norm and just makes me go, oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So I imagine that the for the amount of like creating and making that you do, um it it would probably get quite isolating. Is that's is am I right saying that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been very comfortable in being alone. I think there's a really important division in between solitude and loneliness. Um, and
Mm.
like I've got good friends that I handle outside of work, and balancing a work life balance is very important for everyone, especially someone like me who can spend, sometimes 16 hours in one day just locked in a room watching the dog run around outside making sawdust. Um, I don't really mind being alone. It's something I've always been very comfortable with. I think over the years I've grown very comfortable, very accepting, and very tolerant of who I am as a person. And so I don't really need distractions from that. But, balancing work and life and maintaining friendships and letting people know you love them is something that's also very important.
Hmm. Yeah. So how do you balance that sort of the the inherent need to do something on your own with staying involved and active in a community?
Well, for me, I'm a self-employed insomniac, so I've got a lot more hours in a day than most people. But also, I'm not really one who's prone to working every single day. I'm the kind of guy who might put in 12 or 16 hours 3 days a week and then spend the rest of the time just either volunteering or fundraising for either charities or individuals who are in financial need or just interacting with people in general.
Hmm. What's your network of colleagues and companions like?
Professionally or personally?
I guess let's start with professionally.
Okay. There's a community online called MaestroNet, which is where I interact with a lot of my other luthier compatriots, I suppose. Um, and it's interesting in that not only can we sort of fixate on our line of work, we can also sort of explore our own lives and livelihoods outside of our work. And it's been fascinating to me how sort of diverse we are in spite of all having found our way into violin making. Because there are people that are former opera singers, there are people that are former ballerinas or ballerinos, and there are people who were basically carpenters who then went, you know what, not quite fussy enough, violins.
So yeah, so even amongst like the kind of the very, again, white skin, white hair, kind of community, like you like you still find those opportunities to work with a range of different artists.
Well, and I think the important thing of working with sort of a wide range of people, even within your own industry, is that like every single living person has biases based on their own experiences, and interacting with several people allows you to encounter a range of different biases that you can then sort of weigh against each other and help cancel out. I think there's this weird thing where even the very science-minded violin makers who sort of go, "Hey, here is modulus elasticity and the density of the wood and the modulus of rupture of the wood, and here's the math required to figure that out in terms of getting it to resonate at a certain frequency." um, I think even they bring things to the table that I might not have as someone who sort of just carves away at wood and then knocks it until it sounds about right.
I mean, I'm sure you think about it a little bit more than that.
There is math involved, but I don't really fixate on that. I go, okay,
Yeah.
that'll get me in the ballpark, and then I can fine tune and finagle from there.
Yeah. So how much it seems like there's very much like a left brain, right brain kind of thing to what you do. Do you find that you lean more towards one, or how is it trying to sort of strike the balance between the
I
mathematical and the
think
artistic?
the interesting thing for me in general is that I'm an autistic man who was diagnosed late in life. So I'm not necessarily wired in the same neatly divisive way as a lot of people where it's entirely right
Sure.
brain or left brain. I sort of just go, hey, what is it that I can rationalize? What is it that makes sense to me? And then I can work from there. So I do basically baseline mathematics in order to figure out things like density and modulus elasticity in order to approximate the thicknessing and graduations of the top and back plates. But I don't rely on that entirely. I will use that to get me close to where I want to be, and then I will do things like tap tuning. This is where you basically just tap the back or top of the violin, see what frequency that resonates at, and then you can fine tune that by thinning or sorry, stiffening or thinning the plates in terms of actually fine tuning it to proper notes so that you don't end up with unpleasant wolf tones or buzzing or weird muted sounds on certain strings for certain positions. And then
Yeah.
there's also just the artistic part where, you have to pick varnish colors and do shaping and purfling and all those fun and exciting things or cute little winged lion inlays for some reason.
So let's go back to your sort of set of colleagues and companions. What about on the personal side of things? Like, how did your personal connections influence the art that you do?
I grew up in a fairly poor neighborhood that was largely refugees from El Salvador and Kenya and Somalia. And that sort of exposed me to a range of different experiences in terms of the lives you've actually lived and the experiences you've had as a person. And I think that's what led me, even from an early age, to knowing that my experiences and my viewpoint are not the only way that things exist. And it's made me a lot more accepting of people being like, hey, I know that's correct, but I don't like that. Can you do something different? And I'll be like, yeah, sure, you've got it. It's
Yeah.
your instrument, you're the one making the art, I'm just doing the woodworking.
Yeah. Um, so when you hear back from musicians about the the instruments that you've made, how do you ever hear back about what the like what you've made has impacted the art that they make?
I've got a viola on the go right now that I've designed from the ground up for a specific player. She is an Ashkenazim, so she was an Ashkenazi Jewish woman, and she does things like playing a mourner's kaddish on the viola rather. And because of that, I knew I wanted it to be sort of soulful and warm and not just sad sounding, because I mean, a mourner's kaddish is not just sad, it's a celebration of life and a memorial of death at the same time. So I knew I needed it to be sort of rich and colorful and meaningful in the bottom end, and then still have sort of a sparkle or glimmer of hope at the top. And that's something I've designed, and I'm still working on it. Sometimes when I do a fully custom commission, I will get it essentially finished, mail it out, get feedback from them, and then have it shipped back and do a
Hmm.
little bit of fine tuning in terms of getting it exactly where it needs to be for that particular player. And so far, she's already been a lot more expressive with it and a lot more willing to play it in terms of not just like sitting down for an hour practicing, getting it over with, in terms of, doing something she enjoys to pass the time. And that's been meaningful to me because, like, as much as music is sometimes viewed as a very rigid art form, it is essentially and at its core a form of expression. Whether or not you're doing things technically correct is almost meaningless when it comes to the actual heart and soul and meaning of music as an entity.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so yeah, this is really interesting. I'm really loving this conversation. So like how no, really. Like I've never really considered how like collaborative the relationship would be between the luthier and the musician. But but I
It's not
guess when
always because, like, I do stock builds as well, which is where I just go, this is what I feel like building, so this is what I'm building, and then I'll offer those for sale. And those are generally a lot more reasonably priced. And even then, I'll do accommodations, things like I'll take the top off, do a little bit of regraduation if you want something specific, or adjust the setup just for you as a player. But when it comes to doing an actual commission, so someone comes up to me and goes, "Hey, could you build me this for this purpose?" I think it's important that they are able to express themselves and their intent on the instrument more than just me going, "Hey, this is me. Look how great I am." You know?
yeah, 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 and that's sort of what you just said. That's really at the core of everything that you do, not just instrument making, but
Yeah, I love people, and I love people in a deep and meaningful way. And because of that, I think, I'll give whatever I can of myself without, self-destructing in terms of helping build other people up. Because ultimately, I am a cis white man, and because of that, I'm afforded opportunities that other people may not be.
right.
And I can't, unilaterally eliminate that privilege that I have, but I can do what I can to help lift other people up until societally we sort of go, "Hey, cut that out."
Yeah. Um, so to go into your like to sort of a different sort of creative realm for you, I've heard you sing a couple of times, and seriously, you have like one of the most incredible operatic voices that I've heard, like to rival the greats. Seriously. Um, but if I remember correctly, I think you said that you've had like a vocal injury develop.
In a sense. I had a pituitary tumor that developed during puberty and then was finally diagnosed at 18 and removed at 19. And doing that, A, caused a minor stroke. So these three fingers don't work very well, which is why I don't play any instruments. Like, the surgery itself caused a minor stroke.
Oh,
And also just a scarring on the sinus tissue because they went in for the surgery transsphenoidally, which is where they go in through the nose with what is essentially a knife on a stick, cut through the back of the sinus, and then remove the tumor from the pituitary gland, which is sort of at the front of the brain. And it's just a scarring on the sinus that's impacted more or less my breath control, but also a little bit my tonality.
hmm.
It's been not ideal, but I've learned to live with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I think you might have posted something on Instagram or whatever where you were singing recently, and I was like, he's still got it. You know?
Yeah, I think the fascinating thing for me is that, like, I don't have any formal education in anything. I went to trade school for a year and then dropped out just because I didn't like the toxicity and the atmosphere of it. Um, but I grew up essentially on opera and jazz music, and so those are the two things that more or less shaped my experience, which is bizarre because my parents are both very much top 40 individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I've had this conversation with a couple other people, um, about the difference between a formal education through a college or university or an apprenticeship or whatever it may be, um, but you sort of come up through the other side, sort of a more experiential, experimental kind of education. So for people who are interested in doing, what they enjoy doing what they like, um like it's very sort of very easy to be encouraged to just to go to school and do that. But what
Yeah.
you've done is pretty courageous to sort of go and do it your own way. So how would you just sort of how would you help someone do it the way that you've done it?
I usually jokingly say that I went to the school of books, YouTube, and screwing up. And I think that last thing is the most important. For me, essentially, if you can make a birdhouse and if you can make mistakes without hating yourself for it, you can build a violin. It might not be an award winning violin, it might not be the best violin in the world, but it's going to be something that someone can use to express themselves artistically. There were a bunch of great books and a few good YouTube channels that I'd relied on when I was learning. But more than that, I just made a lot of significant and tremendous mistakes. And then later on, I was able to sit down and reflect on those and go, hey, no, I was stupid 3 weeks ago. I'm better now.
Yeah. So um how do you sort of feel about your position now on the other side, because you're sort of making instructional things, whether it's I think it's mainly on TikTok right now, if is that right?
Yeah, it's mostly on TikTok. I've got a couple long YouTube videos that I've sort of farmed off to be edited because I don't like editing
Yeah.
that are coming up. One was on building a DIY violin kit, and then one is on tap tuning, which is where you thin the plates until they resonate at the frequency that you want. Um, it's been important for me to sort of break down barriers and go, hey, you don't need a formal education, although in many cases it is advantageous. And I know that, not everyone can pursue a traditional apprenticeship. There are not very many luthiers in the area. There aren't that many luthiers around in general in terms of traditional violin making anymore. And so, the path of a traditional apprenticeship is very much going the way of the dinosaur. Um, and so I can't realistically, take on 100 apprentices at a time, but I can go, hey, here are things that I learned from experience that I can give to you now just as a gift.
Mm, mm. You've done, I mean, so many different things. It seems like if you get an inkling to try something, or it's like I want to buy this, but I want to see if I can make it first. What's that, having that mindset like for you?
Chaotic, but generally rewarding.
Yeah.
Um, for me, it's been basically since I was a kid, I've needed constant stimulation, both physically, mentally, and otherwise. And for me, sitting down for an hour and doing nothing is absolutely a alien experience for me. It's not something that I do very often. Um, and so because of that, I've pursued a lot of different paths in life. I've done everything from being a super heavyweight boxer to apprenticing under corsetier, making bras, and I do that for boob owners that are in shelters and donate them at Christmas time too. And I've done a lot of different things, and for me, it's not that I will abandon former interests. I'll just acquire new
Mm,
ones on top of it, and then if I need to, I'll fall back on it.
mm,
I worked in a sideshow for about a year, basically to raise money for going to trade school, and then dropped out. And
yeah.
that's, I think, the most bizarre thing I've done, thing that seems most out of character.
What what inspires you to try something new? Obviously, there's this sort of need to always be doing something, but what helps you to choose what you want to do? Because you have such a diverse range of experiences. So what would attract you to do something?
I think at my core, I'm a farmer of joy. So I will do anything that'll facilitate joy either in myself or someone else. And generally, it's someone I care about, but sometimes it's just a stranger. I'm like, hey, this would make you happy, so I'll figure this out. Um, and I think that's been sort of the underpinning drive in everything I've ever done in that it's either, hey, this is something that makes me happy because I've dealt with depression for most of my existence, or something that'll bring joy to someone else because the world can be scary, the world can be isolating, and I just want to go, hey, here's a hug in a way that isn't actually invading your bubble, especially during a pandemic.
um well, I mean, I want to thank you for being like one of the most caring people that I know, and one of the most interesting, and like always interesting, always creative. Like it's so fascinating just to follow you and see what you're doing. I mean, and it's you're always unpredictable. I never know what you're going to create. Like even just in this conversation, I had a few things that I wanted to ask you, but I was just like, you know what? Let's just see where this conversation goes. Because if I know Taylor, I know it's going to be, yeah, there's always going to be something, something new to talk about. So thank you.
It's been a weird and wonderful life.
Yeah, yeah. So where can people find the things that you do?
In terms of violin making, you can check me out at lethbridgeviolins.com or lethbridge.xyz if you don't feel like typing that much. It's Leth bridge. My guitars are at twitchguitars.com. And on TikTok, I'm at Luthier Taylor, which is LUTHIER TAYLOR.
Great. And there'll be links to all that stuff in the description of the video as well. So be sure to check out everything that Taylor's doing, and try to keep up.
I'm easy to find. I'm not a man of many secrets.
Well, thanks again for coming on, Taylor. It was great talking with you.
Oh, thanks for having me. Always down to chat.
All right. See ya.
See ya.